Spring 1945. The war in Europe was burning itself out, but no one inside the transport truck believed in endings. The roads stretched through the heart of a continent, torn open mud wire, and the faint echo of artillery still rolling beyond the horizon. Inside the truck sat a handful of prisoners, silent, hollow-eyed uniforms stiff with salt and dust. No one spoke. They had been told what to expect if captured: humiliation, hunger, the slow unraveling of dignity. Each bump in the road drove the fear deeper into their bones. Outside, the dawn was a pale gray, the kind of light that makes even freedom look cold. When the vehicle finally stopped, boots hit the ground in unison, and the prisoners lifted their eyes to meet a world they did not recognize. It wasn't the barren field of punishment they'd imagined. It was something else. The air carried no stench of blood or smoke. Instead, it was heavy with a strange warmth, a smell they hadn't known in years, food perhaps or coffee drifting on the wind. For a moment, no one moved. The silence inside them was louder than the engines cooling behind the wire fence. One of the prisoners swallowed hard, uncertain whether to feel relief or dread. This was the enemy's land, and yet the first thing that touched them was not hatred, but the scent of something human. Whatever this place was, it would not fit easily into the stories they had been told. Something in them shifted. Fear gave way to confusion, and confusion to a dangerous thought. What if everything they believed about the enemy was wrong? For a long moment, no one moved. The prisoners stood frozen, their boots sinking into the gravel as the sound of the truck's engine faded into the distance. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. They had braced themselves for shouts, for the crack of rifles, for the sharp sting of humiliation that every rumor had promised. Instead, the air was still almost peaceful, and the first thing to break it was the clatter of metal trays somewhere beyond the gate. It was an ordinary sound, but it cut through their fear like a blade. One of the prisoners, young, his cheeks still hollow from weeks of starvation, turned to the others, eyes wide, as if seeking confirmation that this was real. No one answered. There was nothing to say. They had arrived in enemy hands, yet what surrounded them felt unnervingly civilized. A guard gestured for them to walk. His voice was firm, but not cruel. The line began to move. Boots scraped stone chains, clinked softly, and the dawn spread across the camp like an old photograph, coming to life tents and barracks stretching in rows, floodlights dimming as the sun took their place. The smell that had struck them moments earlier grew stronger, now roasted meat bread, toasting coffee, percolating somewhere unseen. For men who had spent months gnawing on crust and ration dust, it was intoxicating. One of them, an older corporal who had survived the Eastern Front, breathed in deeply, then flinched as if the air itself might be a trap. "They're mocking us," he muttered under his breath, voice cracking. "That's all this is." They expected laughter from the guards, the kind of laughter victors reserve for the defeated. But none came. The Americans moved with quiet efficiency, their expressions unreadable. When they reached the checkpoint, each prisoner was searched, logged, and tagged with a number. The process was impersonal, almost bureaucratic, and that in itself was unsettling. Where was the hatred? Where was the vengeance they had been told to expect? Even cruelty would have made sense. This strange order, this silence, was harder to endure. As they were led deeper into the compound, they caught sight of what lay beyond the wire: neat rows of vegetable gardens, a small wooden chapel, a yard where a few men in different uniforms, prisoners, perhaps from another convoy, were sweeping the ground. No one was being beaten. No one screamed. Somewhere a dog barked and another guard barely older than them stooped to scratch its neck. The simple human gesture twisted something inside the captives. It wasn't kindness they felt, it was disorientation, as if reality itself had slipped. When they reached the main yard, they were told to line up. The command came in clear English, spoken without malice. The prisoners obeyed. Their shadows stretched long across the gravel. For the first time, they saw the faces of their captors in daylight, men in clean uniforms, faces sunburned but calm. One of them carried a clipboard, another a canteen of water that he offered down the line without hesitation. The gesture was so casual, so ordinary, that it felt almost insulting. A few of the captives hesitated, expecting the trick to reveal itself. When none did, they drank in silence, the water cold and pure against their throats. Inside, confusion battled with pride. They were soldiers trained to see mercy as weakness, compassion as deceit. Yet everything in front of them defied that logic. The barracks they were assigned to were not cages, but long wooden huts, their windows open to the rising Sunday. The beds were narrow but clean, each with a blanket folded at the foot. Along one wall stood a shelf stacked with soap, towels, even shaving kits. It felt obscene to see such things after the filth of the front. One man laughed a short broken sound that turned to tears before he could stop it. The guards noticed but said nothing. That silence, the refusal to mock or comfort, was more haunting than any insult could have been. The men unpacked what little they carried, torn letters, faded photos, medals that meant nothing now. They had been stripped of rank, of country, of purpose, but in this strange ordered place, something else was beginning to take root, an unease that was not born of fear, but of doubt. Outside the camp was waking. The clang of pots echoed from the kitchen, followed by the hiss of frying oil. A smell drifted in through the barrack windows, eggs, bacon, and coffee. The men froze. One of them whispered, "They're feeding us," that as if the idea itself were impossible. Hunger tore at their restraint, yet pride held them still. Then a guard appeared at the doorway, motioning for them to move toward the mess hall. The line formed hesitantly, each step a battle between instinct and disbelief. Inside, the mess light poured through open slats glinting off steel trays. American cooks moved behind the counter, scooping food without expression, their motions mechanical. When the prisoners received their portions, they stood staring at them, bread thick and warm, beans, a small strip of meat glistening with grease. One by one, they sat, hands trembling. For a long moment, no one touched their food. Then the youngest, barely 20, took a bite. The sound of chewing was shockingly loud. He closed his eyes, swallowed, and whispered, "Real?" The word spread like a secret, "Real." As they ate, something unspoken filled the air, a weight heavier than any hatred. It was the unbearable realization that the enemy's world, the one they had been taught to despise, was functioning, abundant, alive. The war had destroyed everything they knew, and yet, here across the ocean, people woke to warm meals and quiet order. The knowledge cut deeper than hunger ever had. When the meal was over, they were dismissed back to the yard. The morning sun had climbed high, painting long shadows across the wire fence. The guards resumed their posts, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. It was not freedom, but neither was it the hell they expected. The prisoners exchanged glances, some defiant, some hollow. One man muttered, "They'll show their true face soon enough." Another answered quietly, "Maybe this is it." The hours dragged on. They were given soap and water to wash, and as they scrubbed the grime from their skin, it felt like peeling off layers of the war itself. Some refused clinging to their dirt as a final symbol of resistance. Others surrendered to the simple comfort of cleanliness. The sunlight outside turned golden and the air buzzed with the hum of insects and distant laughter from the guards' quarters. It sounded almost like peace, and that frightened them most of all. That night, as they lay in their bunks, sleep did not come easily. The smell of food still clung to their memories. The sound of boots, the even breathing of other men, the faint rustle of wind through the cracks, all of it felt unreal. They were supposed to be prisoners, yet nothing about this place fit the image of captivity burned into their minds. A few whispered quietly in the dark, trying to make sense of it. Was this strategy a test, or had they truly misjudged the nature of their enemy? No one had answers. The only certainty was that something fundamental had shifted inside them. They had expected pain and found order. They had prepared for hatred and met restraint. The contradiction was unbearable, yet strangely magnetic. It drew them forward, forcing them to look closer, to listen harder. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, a train horn cried into the night, long and mournful, fading into the distance. One of the prisoners stared at the ceiling, his hands folded behind his head, and whispered, to no one in particular, "Maybe the war isn't what we thought it was." And in that small confession, half prayer and half surrender, the first crack appeared in the wall of everything they had been taught. Morning came not with the roar of sirens or the rumble of guns, but with the sharp ring of a bell cutting through the pale Texas light. For the prisoners, it was a sound both foreign and strangely gentle, a command not barked in rage, but spoken through routine. They rose from their bunks, still half expecting chaos to return, half afraid the peace would vanish if they blinked too long. Outside, the air was cool, heavy with the smell of dust and dew. Guards moved past the barracks in measured steps, rifles slung lowvoices.com. It was discipline without cruelty, order without the shadow of madness. For men who had survived the collapse of an empire, the quiet was almost unnerving. Their days fell into a rhythm they hadn't known since before the war roll call breakfast, work detail, letters rest. The structure itself became a kind of shock. They were prisoners, yet their lives were now measured by bells and routines rather than fear. At breakfast, the same cooks worked behind the counter, serving portions that felt too generous for men who had lost a war. Bread, still warm coffee, dark and bitter, potatoes fried in oil. They ate in silence, torn between gratitude and disbelief. A man could almost forget he was behind wire if he focused only on the taste. But then he would look up and see the fence glinting in the sun, a reminder that everything comforting here was also a cage. Work came next. Some were assigned to repair fences, others to clean tools or tend the vegetable plots near the edge of camp. The guards watched, but not with suspicion, more with expectation, as if hard work itself were a kind of medicine. The strange part was how quickly the body adapted. The men began to move with purpose, again their hands remembering skill, their eyes seeking patterns in the soil and wood. The chaos that had defined the final months in Europe was replaced by a steadiness that felt almost holy. For the first time in years, no one was screaming orders over the sound of explosions. The only rhythm now was the scrape of shovels, the ring of hammers, and the distant hum of a truck delivering supplies. At noon, the sun hit hard. Heat rolled across the camp in waves, baking the ground until the air shimmered. Sweat clung to every inch of skin, mixing with dust and memory. In those moments, the prisoners would glance toward the horizon, the open land beyond the barbed wire, endless and cruel in its freedom. Some cursed under their breath. Others simply stared, unable to look away. One guard, seeing the longing in their faces, tossed a canteen toward the nearest man. "Drink," he said flatly. No mockery, no threat, just a command born of practicality. The man hesitated, then drank deeply, the water burning his throat with its coldness. He nodded once, a wordless truce sealed in sunlight. Afternoons passed slowly. Letters were allowed once a week. The prisoners lined up at a small wooden table near the administrative hut, pencils and thin sheets of paper waiting. Writing was harder than they remembered. What could they say to families still buried in the ruins of cities they had left behind? How could they describe this place without sounding like liars? "I am safe" became the phrase everyone used. It was the only truth that didn't feel like betrayal. Some wrote of the food cautiously afraid the censors might think it a code. Others described the heat, the fences, the routine, all facts, but never the emotion behind them. The act of writing itself, of shaping words with steady hands, gave them something war had stolen, the illusion of control. Evenings brought the sound of laughter from the guards' quarters, music, sometimes a radio playing a swing tune that drifted over the yard. It was a melody from another world, a reminder that outside this wire people still danced, still fell in love, still believed in tomorrow. The prisoners listened from their bunks, the rhythm mocking and mesmerizing at once. Some tapped their fingers to the beat before catching themselves ashamed of how easily the foreign notes crept under their skin. Others covered their ears, whispering prayers to drown out the sound. Among them, conversations began to change. The bitterness that had filled their first nights slowly thinned, replaced by uneasy curiosity. They started noticing small details. The guards never struck a man without cause. The rations arrived on time. Even the mail was sorted by name, not number. One evening, as they gathered near the fence, a man said quietly, "Maybe this is how they win, not with guns, but with rules." No one answered, but the thought lingered. Rules. The Americans followed them with a precision that felt almost sacred, and that in itself was terrifying. Days turned into weeks. The camp began to feel like a strange imitation of life. They worked, they ate, they slept. Time lost its meaning. Yet every man carried the same contradiction in his chest, relief and humiliation tangled into one. They had found stability inside, defeat decency, inside captivity. It was easier to fight an enemy who hated you, harder to hate one who treated you like a man. That was the cruelty of kindness. It left no scars to justify the pain. The human touches, though small, began to unsettle them more than any punishment could. A guard lending a cigarette without a word. A nurse setting down clean bandages with a quiet thank you. The sound of laughter when someone slipped in the mud and wasn't shot for it. These fragments of normal life cut deep, reopening wounds they didn't know they had. The war had taught them to see the world in absolutes, victory or death, loyalty or treason. But here behind the wire, the lines blurred. They were still soldiers, but the uniforms that defined them had been stripped away, and what was left underneath was simply human. At night, when the camp settled into silence, thoughts crept in like ghosts. They thought of home, of mothers standing in ration lines of cities, burning of brothers, still fighting for a cause that already felt like ash. The guilt was a living thing pressing against their ribs. To be alive, fed, and warm while their country starved, there was no comfort in that. Some dreamed of escape, not for freedom, but for penance. Others dreamed only of sleep without memory. One evening, a storm rolled in from the plains, thick clouds swallowing the Sunday. Lightning cracked across the sky, lighting the wire fences like veins of fire. The rain came down hard, drumming on the tin roofs of the barracks. The prisoners stood by the windows, watching the guards outside, soaked, shivering, yet holding their posts. One man laughed bitterly. "Even their storms are cleaner," he said. No one replied. The rain washed through the yard, cutting small rivers into the dirt. When it finally stopped, the air smelled of earth and iron. The guards handed out towels, muttering something about the next day's work, as if nothing had happened. The sheer normality of it was unbearable. Weeks passed. The rhythm of captivity became muscle memory. They woke, worked, ate, wrote, slept. But beneath that repetition, a deeper tension grew, the knowledge that this routine, this fragile peace, was built on loss. They were not free men, no matter how clean the sheets or how steady the meals. Every comfort was a reminder of the freedom they no longer possessed. And yet, the longer they lived within this structure, the harder it became to hate it. They found themselves admiring the order, the efficiency, the quiet dignity of a system that functioned even in war. It was a mirror held up to everything they had been taught to believe, and it reflected a truth too painful to name. As another day ended, the sky bled orange over the camp. The men gathered near the fence, their faces half lit by the dying light. Beyond the wire, the land stretched endless, the wind whispering through dry grass. One of them spoke softly, almost to himself. "We're safe," he said, "but not free." Another answered, "Maybe freedom isn't what we thought it was." The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. The guards called, "Lights out." The bell rang again, steady as a heartbeat, marking another day survived, another piece of certainty lost. And as darkness settled over the camp, they realized that captivity had become its own kind of war, a quieter one fought not with bullets but with conscience. The days in the camp began to blur together, each one folded neatly into the next, predictable, almost mechanical. The rhythm of captivity had become their new heartbeat, the morning bell, the roll call, the work assignments. Yet beneath that order, something restless stirred. The men were fed, clothed, even allowed to write home, but there was still an unspoken question burning behind their eyes. What kind of enemy builds a prison this clean, this calm? That question found its answer one afternoon when a guard appeared at the barracks door and called out a list of names. They were told to report to the infirmary. None knew why. Some thought punishment. Others imagined interrogation. Either way, the word carried weight. Infirmary was not a place that promised comfort to soldiers of the defeated Reich. The air outside was sharp and dry, carrying the scent of dust and diesel. As they crossed the yard, the sound of distant machinery echoed from beyond the perimeter, trucks loading tools, clanging men shouting in English. It wasn't chaos, it was coordination, the hum of a system that never stopped moving. When they reached the infirmary, the first thing that struck them wasn't fear, it was the smell. Not the rot of blood and infection they remembered from field hospitals, but antiseptic alcohol soap, cleanliness. One of them hesitated at the threshold, unable to step inside. It was too foreign, too alive. Inside, everything gleamed. Metal trays, white sheets, glass bottles, neatly labeled and stacked on shelves. Cabinets full of gauze bandages, surgical instruments so polished they caught the light like silver. But what stopped them cold were the small glass vials resting in a refrigerator near the far wall, rows upon rows of penicillin. The label was unmistakable. Back home, that single word was spoken like a miracle whispered among surgeons as something rarer than gold. A single dose could save a man's life, but in Germany, it was reserved for officers or propaganda. Yet here the medicine stood in abundance, chilled and waiting. One of the prisoners, a former medic named Bauer, felt his stomach twist. He had seen men rot from wounds that could have been healed if they'd had half this supply. He whispered almost to himself, "This could have saved battalions." Another man spat bitterly on the floor. "They drown in it while we bled." The guard at the door turned his expression unreadable. "Clean it up," he said, not with anger but simple authority, and they obeyed. The Americans moved among them, issuing instructions in brisk, neutral tones. They were to assist, not heal, to clean beds, wash instruments, carry linens. At first, the prisoners approached every order with suspicion, expecting humiliation to follow. But the tasks were straightforward, and the guards did not mock or threaten. When one nurse saw Bauer struggling to tie a bandage, she simply took the roll from his hands, showed him once, and handed it back. "Like this," she said. Her accent was clipped, her tone impersonal, but the act was something he hadn't felt in years: patience. The days in the infirmary grew into a strange kind of revelation. The Americans ran it like a clock. Every bottle, every tool had its place. Every sheet was folded the same way. They did not hoard supplies, they replenished them. Trucks arrived daily with crates of medicine, food, linens, even cigarettes. Nothing seemed scarce. The rhythm of it, the precision, was almost military in its perfection, but not born of desperation. It was built on something deeper, a foundation of abundance that felt impossible to those who came from hunger. At night, Bauer would lie awake thinking of the hospitals. He had known wards lit by candlelight surgeons, working in bloodied coats, nurses cutting bandages from old uniforms. He remembered carrying dying men out into the snow because there were no beds left, no morphine, no hope. Now he worked beside refrigerators, humming with medicine cabinets, overflowing with order. It wasn't just wealth, it was infrastructure, a nation that could build and feed and heal all at once, even while fighting a world war. That realization cut sharper than any insult. One afternoon, while cleaning a table, Bauer overheard an American medic talking to a nurse. "We've got another shipment coming in from Illinois, 3 crates of penicillin." The nurse sighed. "We'll have to make room." They said it casually, as if discussing the weather. Bauer froze. Crates. Shipments. In Germany, men had died for a single bottle. Here, it was an afterthought. The ease of it was unbearable. He began to notice the smaller details, the electric lights that never flickered, the fresh linens that replaced the old before they wore out, the endless coffee that fueled the staff. It wasn't arrogance. It was efficiency, a quiet confidence that came from never having known scarcity. And that more than the fences or rifles was what broke him. The Americans had built a war machine that didn't just destroy it, sustained. Their power wasn't in the weapons, it was in their ability to keep producing while the rest of the world starved. During a break, one of the guards leaned against the doorframe, watching the men work. "Not what you expected, huh?" he said in a low voice. No one answered. The guard smiled faintly, almost kindly. "You'll see. We build things here, we don't just burn them." Then he walked away, leaving the words to sink like stones. Later that evening, Bauer was assigned to help a wounded German prisoner who had been brought in from another camp, a soldier with a leg infection. The American doctor, overseeing the treatment, barely looked up. "We'll save it," he said, reaching for the penicillin without hesitation. Bauer watched in silence as the injection went in the fevered man's breathing, easing within hours. He had seen hundreds die from the same wound, their bodies buried in frozen trenches. Now, here under the enemy's roof, a life was saved with a medicine his own homeland had treated as myth. The next morning, he could not bring himself to eat. The food on his plate, fresh eggs, bread, fruit, felt obscene. Every bite tasted like shame. Around him, others ate silently, heads bowed, each man lost in his own reckoning. They had fought for a world that promised strength, purity, destiny. Yet the truth in front of them was undeniable. Their enemies had built something stronger, not through cruelty, but through creation. As the days passed, their sense of certainty eroded. Conversations in the barracks turned hushed defensive. "It's just propaganda," one man insisted. "They're showing us this to make us weak." Another shook his head. "You can't fake this much food." The arguments always ended in silence because no one could deny what their eyes had seen. The abundance was real. The order was real. And the realization that they had been deceived for years was a wound deeper than any bullet could leave. Bauer found himself studying the Americans more closely, their discipline, their humor, even their contradictions. They worked hard, complained little, and treated prisoners with an indifferent fairness that was somehow more unsettling than hatred. He wondered if they saw him as human or simply as another task on a long list. It didn't matter. In their world, even duty had dignity. One evening after his shift, he lingered near the supply room. The door stood open, revealing shelves stacked high with boxes and bottles all labeled and cataloged. He reached out fingertips, brushing the cold glass of a vial. For a moment, he felt something he couldn't name, envy, awe, maybe grief. Behind him, a voice spoke quietly. "We take care of what we have. That's how we win." Bauer turned. It was the same nurse as before, her expression unreadable. "You should get some rest," she added, then turned away. That night, he lay awake listening to the hum of the generators that powered the camp. The sound was steady, endless, almost comforting. He thought of Germany in ruins, of cities without light, of hospitals without power. He thought of the endless speeches, the promises of supremacy, the faith he had once carried like armor. Now all he could see was the hollow shell of it crushed under the weight of this simple, undeniable truth they had lost. not because the enemy was crueler, but because the enemy had built a world that worked. He turned in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, feeling the crack widen inside him. The propaganda, the pride, the lies, they all crumbled under the evidence of full shelves and humming machines. The war, he realized, had been fought not just on battlefields, but in factories, in hospitals, in the quiet rhythm of supply and care. And in that war, the one of endurance of creation, they had already been defeated long before the shooting stopped. The days in the infirmary had begun to carve something new into Bauer's mind, an awareness that frightened him more than any weapon ever could. The abundance no longer shocked him, it haunted him. Every morning when he walked past those shelves of supplies, when he saw the endless rows of medicine and tools, he felt the same unease, a gnawing thought that perhaps strength was not what he had been taught to believe. But it wasn't until the contradictions began to take human form that the truth started to unravel inside him completely. It happened slowly, almost quietly. One morning during the daily inspection, Bauer saw a new face among the guards. A tall man in an American uniform, his skin dark as polished bronze, his posture commanding. He spoke in English that rolled like gravel, confident and clear. The German prisoners stiffened. They had grown used to the white faces that patrolled the camp men who fit the picture of authority their propaganda had burned into them since youth. But this sight defied every rule of the world they had believed in. The man carried himself with dignity, not servitude. When he called their numbers, his voice cut through the morning air like any officer's. One of the older prisoners whispered bitterly, "They make even their slaves into soldiers now." Another answered, softer, "Then maybe they were never slaves." The words hung in the air, heavy and forbidden. No one replied. Later that afternoon, Bauer was assigned to assist in the infirmary's recovery ward. A German prisoner lay feverish, shivering under clean sheets, his body weak from pneumonia. The attending nurse walked in clipboard in hand, her voice calm, efficient. Bauer froze. She too was black. For a heartbeat, he forgot to breathe. Back home, such a sight was impossible. In his world, women like her did not hold power, did not wear uniforms, did not command respect. Yet here she stood, calm, competent, unafraid, giving orders to him. "Fresh linens," she said, without looking up. He obeyed, fumbling with the sheets, his hands clumsy with confusion. When she noticed, she met his eyes for the first time. There was no hatred in her gaze, no triumph, just quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from endless work and too many wounds. "Tighten that corner," she said, pointing to the edge of the bed. He did as told. When they finished, she nodded once. "Good," she said, and walked away. It was a single word, but it cut deeper than any insult. That night, Bauer sat on his bunk long after lights out, staring at his hands. The word "good" echoed in his head like a bell. She had said it simply without malice, as if he were no different from anyone else. It was unbearable. Everything he'd been taught, the hierarchy of blood, the purity of race, the destiny of the superior, had been shattered by a nurse folding sheets beside him. He didn't speak of it to the others. He didn't have to. The silence in the barracks told him they were wrestling with the same realization. The contradictions multiplied. A black soldier issuing orders. A Jewish American doctor performing surgery on German prisoners without hesitation. Guards who treated them with formality, even decency, while their own countrymen back home starved in the ruins. The war outside had been painted as a clash of civilizations. But here inside the wire, the lines blurred until right and wrong, conqueror and captive, no longer made sense. At mealtimes, they would sit together and talk in low voices, their words cautious, broken by long silences. "Maybe this is all for show," one man said. "Propaganda for us to take home." Another replied, "If it is, it's the most convincing lie I've ever seen." A third whispered, "Maybe they treat us well because they know they've already won." No one disagreed. Letters from home arrived less frequently now, and when they did, the news was unbearable. Entire cities flattened, families gone, children starving. The prisoners read those words while eating from plates filled with food they didn't deserve. The guilt became a weight none of them could set down. One man tore his letter to pieces and shoved it into his mouth, chewing it as if he could swallow the truth. Another broke down, completely sobbing into his hands. "We were told they were animals," he muttered through tears. "But we became the animals, didn't we?" As the weeks passed, the internal war grew louder than the one that had sent them here. They began questioning everything, their leaders, their oaths, even the God they'd prayed to before battle. Bauer, who had once carried medals for bravery, now felt only shame when he looked at them. One night during a power outage, he sat near the window watching the guards light lanterns along the fence. Rain fell in thin streaks, the glow of lamps turning it into liquid fire. He thought of the nurse again, of her steady hands, her calm voice. The image clashed violently with the speeches that had filled his youth, the ones that spoke of purity, destiny, superiority. He realized those words had been weapons sharper than bullets forged to blind him. The next morning, the camp chaplain held a small service in the mess hall. Attendance wasn't mandatory, but many went drawn by curiosity or the faint need for forgiveness. The chaplain was an older man, gentle-eyed, speaking through a translator. His sermon was simple. Even in war, he said, mercy is not weakness. It is strength held in restraint. The prisoners listened in silence. Bauer stared at the floor, his throat tightening. He had spent years believing mercy was something to be scorned, a flaw in the armor of nations. Now he saw it differently. The Americans didn't show mercy because they were soft. They showed it because they could afford to. And that realization terrified him. That evening, as the sun sank behind the wire, a small group of prisoners gathered behind the barracks. The air was thick with heat and dust, the sky streaked in blood-red light. Do you ever wonder, one asked, what happens when we go home? What we'll tell them? Bauer didn't answer. Someone else said, if we tell the truth, no one will believe us. The group fell silent. They all knew it was true. How could they explain that the enemy they'd sworn to hate had treated them with more dignity than their own commanders ever had? As night deepened, the camp quieted, but inside Bauer's chest, a storm raged. The world he had known, the one built on discipline, loyalty, and unquestioned belief, was gone. In its place stood a fragile, unbearable truth that the enemy's strength was not born from cruelty, but from conviction in something larger than hatred. They built, they healed, they followed rules, not out of fear, but faith and fairness and order, and the simple idea that a man's worth wasn't written in his blood. It was a kind of moral architecture, invisible but unshakable. The following day, Bauer was tasked with cleaning near the guard tower. As he swept, he overheard two American soldiers talking. They'll be going home soon, one said. Some of them will never admit what they saw here. The other laughed. Doesn't matter. We didn't do it for them. Bauer stopped mid-motion, his broom frozen in his hand. That sentence struck him like a blow. They didn't do it for them. They did it because it was right. That night, he couldn't sleep. The barracks smelled of wood and soap, and the hum of generators filled the silence. He thought of everything he had seen, the black nurse, the full shelves, the disciplined guards, the prayers in English, the laughter that carried no malice. All of it fit together into a pattern he couldn't ignore. Maybe the true victory wasn't in armies or flags. Maybe it was in the way a nation held on to its humanity when it had no reason to. He rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling, and whispered a question that had no answer. If we had seen the truth sooner, would any of this have happened? The darkness gave him nothing in return, only the sound of the wind against the wire, whispering like a voice too distant to understand. Days turned into months, and the rhythm of the camp began to fade into something deeper, a quiet awareness that none of them could shake. The shock, the disbelief, the moral chaos, they had all passed through it. What remained now was reflection, the slow understanding that everything they had witnessed was not coincidence, not accident, but intention. It wasn't luck that had spared them cruelty, it was design. The Americans had built this order deliberately, and that realization carried a weight heavier than any weapon. Bauer saw it everywhere once he understood what to look for. In the mess hall, where every prisoner received the same portion of food measured equal, consistent. In the infirmary, where wounds were treated not because of nationality, but because they existed. In the guards, whose restraint was not weakness, but policy. Even in the letters, they were allowed to send home carefully censored, but permitted nonetheless. Every act, every rule seemed part of a larger purpose. He had thought mercy was a crack in the armor of power. Now he saw it was the armor itself. One morning he overheard two American officers speaking outside the barracks. Their words were not meant for the prisoners, but the meaning carried anyway. The Geneva rules aren't about them, one said, lighting a cigarette. They're about us. Bauer froze at the doorway, the simple sentence searing into his mind. They're about us. It wasn't compassion born of pity, it was self-definition. They treated their enemies humanely because that was how they measured their own civilization. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about identity. The thought unsettled him not because it was cruel, but because it was true. For years he had been told that strength meant domination, that purity and control justified everything. But here, surrounded by fences, and yet fed, treated, and allowed to live, he saw a different definition of strength, the ability to restrain it. The Americans didn't need to prove superiority by breaking their captives, they proved it by choosing not to. Their moral discipline was as precise as their logistics. In the evenings, when the camp fell quiet, he would sit outside near the fence, staring at the distant horizon glowing with the light of American towns. There was laughter out there, electricity, music, life, continuing as though war were only a shadow on the edge of memory. It made him ache, not with envy, but with understanding. This was what they had been fighting against without realizing it, not a country of decadence and chaos as propaganda had said, but a machine powered by belief in decency itself. That belief had built everything he had seen, the hospitals, the trucks, the endless flow of supplies. It had built the system that had defeated his own, not because it was kinder, but because it was organized around a truth his leaders had mocked, that respect could be a weapon sharper than fear. One evening, the black nurse approached him again in the infirmary. She handed him a clipboard and said, "Sign this." Her voice was calm, her eyes steady. As he took it, he hesitated. "Why do you treat us this way?" he asked, his words trembling. After everything we did, she didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, studying his face as though searching for something beyond apology. "Because the war will end," she said finally, "and what comes after will depend on what you remember of us." Then she walked away. Her words followed him for weeks. They haunted him more than the sound of artillery or the memory of dying men. "What you remember of us?" It was a confession and a challenge all at once. The kindness they had been shown wasn't merely mercy, it was strategy, not to humiliate them, but to plan an idea that would outlive the war. The Americans weren't just winning battles, they were shaping memory itself. In the barracks, conversations began to shift again. No one spoke of escape anymore. Instead, they talked about what it would mean to go home. If we tell them what we saw, one man said they'll call us liars. Another answered, then maybe we say nothing. But silence too became a burden. Bauer knew that some truths could not be buried. The idea that humanity could be stronger than ideology, that compassion could be a deliberate act of power, had taken root too deeply to die. The day came when a new batch of prisoners arrived, gaunt and angry, still burning with the venom of propaganda. Bauer watched them with a strange detachment, as if seeing ghosts of his former self. They sneered at the guards, refused food, spat on the ground. He said nothing. But later, when one of them muttered that the Americans were cowards for showing mercy, Bauer turned sharply. "You think mercy is weakness?" he asked. "Then you've never seen how hard it is to hold power and not use it." The younger man stared at him, confused, maybe frightened. Bauer realized he sounded like the people he once despised, the voices that had dared to question the righteousness of their own side. Weeks later, rumors spread through the camp that the war in Europe was nearing its end. The guards grew quieter, the letters fewer. When the news finally came, Germany had surrendered. The camp fell into a silence so profound, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Some wept, others stared at the ground, hollowed by defeat, too large to comprehend. Bauer felt neither pride nor despair, only a strange calm. The war had ended outside, but inside him, another kind of reckoning had begun. The next morning, the American officer in charge gathered the prisoners in the yard. He spoke through an interpreter, his words measured. "You will all go home soon. What you do with what you've seen here, that will be your choice." Bauer stood in the crowd, his heart pounding. He looked around at the men beside him, the faces that had shared his hunger, his confusion, his awakening. He wondered how many of them would carry the truth with them, and how many would bury it beneath shame. Days later, as the gates opened and the first groups were escorted to the buses, Bauer lingered near the fence one last time. The air smelled of spring, of soil and gasoline, and something faintly sweet. Beyond the wire, the guards stood watching, not triumphant, not cruel, simply steadfast. One of them caught his eye and nodded a silent farewell between men who had never spoken the same language, yet understood each other too well. He turned back to look at the camp, the barracks, the yard, the infirmary that had taught him more than any battlefield ever could. It struck him then that this place meant to confine had freed him in ways he could never have imagined. It had dismantled the lies built into his soul and replaced them with something he didn't yet have words for. He felt no need to speak. As the bus pulled away, the camp shrank in the distance, its fences glinting in the sunlight like threads of glass. Bauer leaned against the window, watching until it disappeared. The hum of the engine filled the silence, and for the first time, he allowed himself to close his eyes without fear. The war had ended, but its lesson would not. He understood now that victory was not measured by who conquered more ground, but by who protected what was human within them when the world demanded otherwise. Outside, the Texas fields rolled endlessly under the sky, golden and quiet. He pressed his hand against the glass, feeling the warmth of the Sunday. For the first time since his capture, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like a witness to something larger, something that could not be undone. Mercy had not just spared his life, it had rewritten his understanding of what it meant to be strong. And as the convoy disappeared into the horizon, Bauer carried with him not the shame of defeat, but the fragile, burning knowledge that humanity itself was the most powerful weapon of all. ChatGPT said, years later, when the guns had long fallen silent and the world rebuilt itself atop the ashes of memory, Bauer would still remember the sound of that Texas wind and the faint hum of generators in the night. He would remember the smell of soap and bread, the quiet discipline of the guards, and the calm voice of a nurse who had shown him what strength truly meant. He never spoke much about the camp, most men didn't. In the ruins of post-war Germany, mercy was a story too strange to tell, too gentle for a nation trying to forget. But sometimes when his children asked about the war, he would pause, stare into the distance, and say only this: not all enemies are what you think. What he meant was that power in its truest form had nothing to do with conquest or fear. It was the power to remain human when everything around you demanded that you stop being one. The Americans had understood that. They hadn't just defeated an army, they had defeated an idea, the belief that cruelty was strength and that compassion was weakness. That understanding stayed with him long after the fences were gone. As he grew old, the images returned in flashes: sunlight glinting on barbed wire, a canteen of cold water passed between enemies, a single word spoken softly good. In those moments, he knew that what survived war wasn't victory or pride, but the choices that preserved dignity when the world was collapsing. The camp had been a prison, but within its boundaries, he had seen something larger than defeat. He had seen the proof that mercy could outlast hate, that even amid the wreckage of nations, humanity could still endure. And that, he realized, was the only kind of freedom that ever truly mattered.